So let me go straight to my topic. I have to speak on a greater kind of enlightenment, because enlightenment is usually associated with 18th century, which is an age of reason, an age of logic, an age of analysis. And that is not unimportant. When I speak of the romantic poetry, in fact, that is why I'm interested in my erudite colleague Mohammed Sen's area, 18th century literature, because enlightenment starts with the mind, with mental knowledge, with intellectual knowledge. And that the 18th century gives us. And it was needed at that time, because people were superstitious. People, in the name of subjectivity, was doing all sorts of nonsense. So we needed Hobbes' law, 18th century. People were suffocated by the brain stuff, that is rational literature, and suffocated because human mind is naturally subjective. Poetry has a natural push towards subjectivity, and so people were suffocated. And you must have heard of pre-romantic poets, Burns, Gray, Cowper, Collins. And in our days, Blake used to be associated with them, but Blake is not with them. Blake is should be in the main body of romantic poetry. And the reason is simple. So when you prepare your answer on the romantic age, there are basically two questions. One is the aspect of revival, and the other is the aspect of revolt. So we must be having any one of the two, the question of revival and the question of revolt. Now, what is revived? The subjectivity of Spenser, Shakespeare, and Marlowe, that is revived, and maybe slightly advanced than the Elizabethan poets, barring Shakespeare. So this subjectivity is where we have to start, and we have to start with Blake. And it was a revival, it was a revolt, and the revolt is expressed adequately by Blake by the end of 1780s. And it was, now remember that when I speak of intuition, between reason and intuition, there is another higher stage of reason. So Aurobindo has spoken of that in Human Cycle, that not always that the intuition is hurried, because after the reason there comes a higher reason. But for Blake it was not just high reason but pure intuition. And as he said in Marriage of Heaven and Hell, that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his kavan. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through the narrow chinks of his kavan. Narrow chinks of his kavan. This is the limitation of intellectual knowledge. it is a small sky that you are seeing through the intellect. Intellect is the beginning of knowledge. But you should move on and move on from buddhi to buddhi. And that is what Blake says in his prose and poetry in the late 1780s. Now, talking of this age, there are certain traditional things which you must know, that this poetry is nostalgic, it has love for nature, it aspires for the divine, and there's a note of escapism, which is used in a derogatory sense, but this escapism is man's quest for the infinite. And there is occult, as you see in Coleridge, the irrational. And there are two kinds of child in romantic poetry. You must have read Blake also, Lamb also, along with Blake. That and also Wordsworth. Wordsworth speaks of a glorified child. Child is the father of man. But intuitive poetry or mystic poetry or imaginative poetry is not divorced from society. Rather, society is examined in a far better way through the inner eyes, through the inward eyes. Society is far better seen. That is what Blake sees in London, when he sees that the next generation will be spoiled. So the mystic is not irrelevant to society, and the romantics are also not irrelevant to society. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
It's fine. You can carry on, sir.
So these are the traditional aspects which any student of literature for preparing the answers must know. It has nostalgia, it has the element of love, it has a love for nature, which is very distinct from the past poetry, and it has a passion for the divine and the occult and the irrational. And I have spoken of the two kinds of child. One is the Wordsworthian child who is glorified, and the other is the exploited child, which you see in Lamb's Chimney Sweepers and Blake's Chimney Sweepers. And tragedies. So this is the picture of exploited child that we see in the prose of Lamb and in the poetry of Blake. Now, Blake should be compared with Coleridge. Sri Aurobindo pairs Blake with Coleridge in the future poetry. And of late, much after Sri Aurobindo, there is now an awareness in the critics to pair Blake with Coleridge, not Wordsworth with Coleridge. Remember this. And Sri Aurobindo began this trend in 1917. That usually we pair Coleridge with Wordsworth because they collaborated. They brought out the lyrical ballads in 1798. So we usually link them. But Sri Aurobindo was the first to link Blake with Coleridge because of this magic eye of occult and vision opening to superphysical worlds. And this was in Coleridge. And Blake is also seeing things, painting things that are not on the surface for men to see. So, if we take Wordsworth separately, then it is true, it is right that he should be the leader of the movement because he is the first against like which Ruskin Bond is doing in a very secret logical humanism. For that, we have to wait for Sri Aurobindo. But he does raise the issue of pollution of the environment, pollution of nature, felling of trees, and the smokes, the poison in the air. And he was flying away from the city to the village around 1895, 1795. And he was trying to feel something which is there in nature. And you must be knowing about his three stages of nature. The first is his physical attraction to nature, then a deeper feeling which comes in his early 20s, and then he discovers the spirit in the wood, like Henry David Thoreau. And this is the role of nature in perfecting human life. How nature widens human consciousness. But Wordsworth in Prelude Book 1 in particular, and in Book 2 also, these first two books, Wordsworth speaks of the blessings of the wind, the air, the green, the lakes, and the whisperings, and as if it's a living entity. And there are fearful moments also, as you see in the first book of Prelude, with reference to the stealing of the boat incident. And so it was natural. He was feeling something living in nature, which has a direct influence on human life, in teaching human life. It's the exact thing what happened to Wordsworth, the exact thing what happens to a writer. This is what makes Sri Aurobindo separate from other critics, because he has an extra pair of eyes, an extra eye on his forehead. He was a great rishi, a yogi. His sight would be much better than Harold Bloom or even Kenneth Muir. So he is exact. He says Wordsworth becomes a philosopher in his later poetry, and he starts thinking in poetry, and it becomes logical once again, analytical, and it is not poetry, it is philosophy. It happens, basically it starts from 1810 onwards that there is, Wordsworth becomes a teacher in verse. And poetry is not teaching. It should be a direct revelation. Wordsworth's early poetry, even when you go through Prelude, it was published in 1850, but the best lines of Prelude were written in the late 1790s. So the young Wordsworth was expert in revelation, compressed revelation. He could reveal in a very brief way, be a very simple way, but later he started thinking, sermonizing, teaching, and poetry is not teaching. So as poetry, as a philosopher, well, he has a great value, but as a poet, the later Wordsworth is a flop. And that is a tragedy, because he had a great possibility, because he started off very well. like lines in Immortality Ode, the winds come to me from the fields of sleep. Wonderful lines of great discovery. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep. And the last stanza of The Reaper, where Wordsworth takes us to the Hebrides. And there is always a suggestion of the infinite in this early poetry of Wordsworth. He is taking us beyond to the lands of Hebrides. That is what great poetry is all about. It speaks of the infinite, it suggests of the infinite, and the greatest thing is about this infinite suggestion in poetry, in romantic poetry, and because the romantic poets, all great poetry is romantic. And even later, I think Yeats is the greatest, if you exclude Rabindranath and Sri Aurobindo from the scene. Whitman and Yeats are the greatest. And both of them are romantics, but a different kind of romantic. A romantic who have a close eye on earth. The material and the spiritual both are important to them. Now, what happens to these 19th century romantic poets in England was they were sometimes divorced from the material life. They couldn't synthesize. Keats, of course, tried a bit, and still there was a note of dissatisfaction, discomfort, and unable to cope with whatever is here. He always tries to fly out there. This is not there in the poetry of Yeats and Whitman. I exclude Tagore and Sri Aurobindo because let us not talk about them. We take them up later. And even if you think of the poetry written by the Americans and the people from England, Whitman and Yeats are the greatest of the romantics. But they are romantics who could synthesize the material and the spiritual. And this is what is failing in Shelley. You will see that Shelley is dissatisfied with this world. He is unhappy with this world. He has a passion for changing this world. As you see in the West Wind, he wants the power of the West Wind to change the earth. And in the Skylark, as against the Skylark of Wordsworth, this Skylark goes away and disappears into the infinite. So Sri Aurobindo has rightly pointed out that he wants to carry this ugly earth philosophically, not as a poet, because he is a great poet in terms of imagery, in terms of rhythm. He is excellent, and in terms of spiritual idea also. Of all the romantics, he has in his possession the most rich spiritual idea. But the problem is he wants to carry this earth to heaven because the earth is very ugly, it should be taken to heaven. And this is just the opposite of Tagore and Sri Aurobindo, who wish to bring down heaven on earth. So the earth has to be purified. You can't escape from this. What will happen to the earth then? This is also true of the poetry of Whitman. He thinks of the earth. Whitman says again and again that I don't want the stars, the constellations, let them be happy there. I am bothered about this planet where I am based, whatever may be its roop, whatever may be its beauty or ugliness. I will stick to earth. So these are earthbound poets, which is not there in Shelley, the best in terms of lyrical power. Definitely, in terms of lyrical power, although as an artist, Keats is a far better artist, but in terms of sheer lyrical power, Shelley is the best. And the interesting thing about him is that he's not happy with one image to describe a thing. He piles up image on image on image to try to seize what he wants to say. And in Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, which is the very important poem, Shelley, you get Shelley's problem. He is frustrated because this intellectual beauty, this shadow of the divine, is playing hide and seek with him. As with all of us, it is playing hide and seek. At midnight, suddenly you see a stream of the moon across the lake. Shelley wakes up to see that, and he finds the intellectual beauty is there, the divine is there manifest. But this hide and seek remains, and he is unable to solve this. And coming to Keats, you reach the most perfect artist of the Romantic period. And he lived, as you know, he lived very short, but he matured very quickly. Great poets, as Rabindra has written to Setna, great poets take time to mature. Even Shakespeare was a late bloomer. If you read Shakespeare's Richard II, the poetry of Richard II, and 4 years later or 5 years later, if you see the poetry of the history plays, and slightly later Macbeth, Hamlet, you'll be surprised that this man wrote this poetry. And that is why Sri Aurobindo says that great poets may take time to mature, but there are exceptions. Between 17 to 25, Keats matured quickly. And of all the Western critics, Sidney Colvin, Kenneth Muir, Bhavatos Chatterjee, of all these great critics, I include Bhavatos Chatterjee also because his book is excellent on Keats, maybe better than many Westerners. But the point is, none of them speak of the gradation of beauty in Keats. They only focus on sensuous beauty. And if you listen to any lecture in the college, in the university, they will speak of Keats as a sensuous poet. Well, that is the basic swadharma in Keats. He is a sensuous poet. Everything he sees through the senses. But Sri Aurobindo points out in the future poetry that there is a gradation of beauty in Keats. And it is not just sensuous beauty. Sensuous beauty, intellectual beauty, imaginative beauty, intuitive beauty, and finally the ideal or divine idea of beauty. So this is the evolution of beauty which only Sri Aurobindo sees, because he is a spiritual detective, and he sees it easily that this man is not just sensuous, he is after deeper things. And sensuousness is not the only note in his poetry. And there is an evolution of consciousness in Keats, and there is an evolution of beauty. And you are reading the two great odes, the Grecian and the Nightingale ode. But hardly anybody tells you, following Sri Aurobindo, that there is an evolution of consciousness in the two odes. I come to the third stanza of the ode on aggression. Earn. And there is an evolution of consciousness, an evolution of beauty in kids, and that is linguistically confirmed by the comparative degree, more, better. How? Let me give you examples. Forever piping songs, forever new. Forever piping songs, forever new. This is a quest for the new, which the mother writes in her diary. The ever progressive new. Now it may be static, the earn, but the quest is an ever progressive new, more happy love. See the comparative degree. More happy love, more happy love, forever warm and still to be enjoyed, forever panting and forever young, all breathing human passions far above that leaves a heart high sorrowful and void, a burning forehead and a parching tongue. Humanity is athirst, feverish, because in layer after layer, the consciousness moves forward in search of a better beauty. Fresh perfection is the phrase Keats uses in Hyperion. At our hill there lies a fresh perfection. Now this comparative degree is interesting. And Sri Aurobindo did not tell me these things, but following Sri Aurobindo's clues, I read again the poems, then I found these poems are supporting Sri Aurobindo's claim that he was after the divine idea of beauty through imaginative beauty, intellectual beauty, intuitive beauty, and finally ideal or divine beauty. And you will see once again in stanza 4 of Grecian Urn, Keats's concept of the sublime, or mountain built with a peaceful citadel. One line is enough. Or mountain built with a peaceful citadel. Now, this is the divine sense of beauty to which Keats was evolving, but Sri Aurobindo laments, he virtually laments, and he says, this is a great tragedy. This is a great tragedy because he lost his life before he was 26. And he says, he entered the innermost sanctuary, but before he reached the courtyard, the frescoed court of a temple, but before he could reach the innermost sanctuary, his life was gone. So like a spiritual detective, Sri Aurobindo is observing Keats's movement towards something. Thou silent form dost tease us out of thought, as doth eternity. Eternity is in the eyes of John Keats, and living under the shadow of death, he is constantly thinking of this eternity. There were two fears, virtually three fears, of which he speaks in Terror of Death. One is the fear that he will die, before he could complete his writings. Second, which is very striking, in stanza 2, you have Keats's frustration that I won't see these huge cloudy symbols of a high romance. So he was aware of a high romance concealed in the stars, and he was after it. And in Ode to Fancy, it starts with a brilliant line, spiritual line. It is not sensuous. If it is sensuous, through the senses, Keats is trying to reach the supreme spirit. I quote, "Ah, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in." And he speaks in his own way because he knows nothing. Philosophy is alien to him. He knows only beauty, only one God he worships. That is beauty. And through beauty he sees everything. So he says, "Ah, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in." Now, the aesthete is sometimes verging on the spiritual. So the finest of aesthete in romantic poetry is quite often verging on the pure spiritual, like the lines I have just quoted. And in the Nightingale Ode, which is a deeper, because there is an intense pain and agony of leaving this planet, because this planet is an opportunity to discover the immortal, the infinite. Without this, nothing can be perceived. So, through this Nightingale, he tries to feel how sorrowful, how miserable is the earthly existence, and how he can even dream of going beyond it through the Nightingale, because he knows somebody must be knowing the secret keys to the place where all is gold and peace and love. And he speaks of that in stanza 3. This is the world, which is, as Shelley says in Prometheus Unbound, the world pining in pain. The world pining in pain, and the world is not happy. And see the images Keats uses, wonderful. The weariness, the fever, and the fret. Fever is a physical fever because as a patient of consumption, he was regularly having slow fever. And then he experiences things where pulse shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. And he has to get rid of this. And he's dreaming about, through the Nightingale, about a world where he can escape. Aega aane wala aega. This expectation, this quest is there, which you see with certainty in the poetry of Tagore and Whitman, even in Yeats. That is not here because the pain is too much. But there are inklings of Keats's perception of the divine idea of beauty. And he speaks of the immortal bird in stanza 7. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. So immortality is a quest. And surprisingly, Keats is a forerunner of the poetry of Sri Aurobindo and Whitman, because they were exploring the idea of death and immortality. Immortality here in this planet, not by taking a leap to somewhere else. Immortality can be established here. এই জীবনে হলো মোর জন্ম জন্মান্তর. That means I have a rebirth even in this life, and I can have repeated rebirths. And immortality in Sri Aurobindo's poetry means that you gain a power through which you can leave your body any moment and come back any moment. Whitman was hinting at it, was very close to it. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien core. Then those magic lines. Sri Aurobindo has given 4 vertical strokes by these treatments, calling it the absolute inevitability in poetry. I quote, which you know, the same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands follow. Charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas and fairy lands follow. জাদু জানলা খুলে যাচ্ছে সফেন সমুদ্রের উপর, দূরে ফেয়ারি ল্যান্ডে নিয়ে যাচ্ছে. This suggestion of the infinite, which confirms that Keats was after an immortality, but Sri Aurobindo calls them poets of the dawn. This was just the dawn of consciousness. And he writes, concluding on Keats, that the time was not ripe to tell all these things in a deeper way. Why does he say this? The time was not ripe. Because evolution was not enough evolved in, say, 1820s. It needed to evolve more. By 1855, it was more evolved in Leaves of Grass. And so there is an aspiration to go beyond death and doom with a spiritual dream which flies away into nothing. He cannot catch it, he cannot seize it. And talking of these romantic poets, I'm reminded of my teacher who taught it at Vishwavarthi many years back, 4 decades, Shishir Kumar Ghosh. He used to tell me that, I was teaching Prometheus Unbound, and he used to, I would go to him in the evening and he would give me notes. This is how you should go about, and these are the points you should note. So, said that the romantics are on the borderline of illumination. They are not in illumination, but they are on the borderline of illumination. So this was very interesting. The romantics are all on the borderline of illumination. They are not illumined people. They were not Walt Whitman or Rabindranath or Sri Aurobindo, but they were on the borderline of illumination. So this borderline romantic poets were extremely important for the evolution of poetry. And also my title was Towards a Greater Enlightenment. So see, I have also used the comparative. Towards a greater enlightenment, I never said greatest enlightenment. So from the 18th century, from Locke and Hobbes, this knowledge is more authentic and deeper. Starting with Locke and Hobbes, starting with Rousseau, they move forward and from buddhi they pass on to bodhi, from intellect to intuition. And naturally, the intellect has a role to play. The 18th century was extremely beneficial to enlightened people, so it was called an age of enlightenment against superstitions. And now a new age comes, which speaks of a greater kind of enlightenment. That is why my title was What's the Greater Enlightenment? And when you speak of Whitman, Tagore, and Sri Aurobindo, then you have to speak of farther enlightenment, and not this towards the real kind of enlightenment. So, and that is why Sri Aurobindo called the Romantics the poets of the dawn. This is the dawn of consciousness, and certainly you can't say they were illogical, they were irrational. As I've said at the beginning of my talk, that there is a reason, and there is an advanced reason, and after that there is intuition. So this, Sri Aurobindo, while speaking of the evolution of society, Sri Aurobindo speaks of this evolution of the sociological stages. Life divine is an evolution of spirituality. The human cycle is an evolution of human society. The two books are different. The language, the style are different. And the meaning is different. He speaks of an evolution of society. Society is moving from reason to better reason. So think of 20 years back, two people staying together. They say we are friends and we can live together. This is perfectly all right. But 20, 30 years back, you couldn't think of it. But this is good that society accepts. Well, of course, they mock at them, they make fun at them, but still they are free to live together without any physical disturbance from society. So this is the point, that the Romantics were one step ahead of that bare kind of enlightenment. It's a better kind of enlightenment through intuition, through bodhi. Like in Coleridge's poetry, it is bodhi. And when Coleridge speaks in prose, when he deconstructs Wordsworth's poetry, it is buddhi, it is intellectual. But when he writes his own poetry, he opens to superphysical worlds, to the occult worlds. And these worlds are real worlds. You can't say they are imagined stuff. They are not imagined stuff. Because to imagine is to realize. And maybe realization may wait, but you have got a clue to that. So all these romantic poets got a clue to a finer sense of spirituality, which is to come in the poetry of one of the greatest non-English poets, Rabindranath Tagore. So I end here, and in case there is any question, I will answer.